The scream still echoed in Katherine Taylor's ears as the stagecoach tilted violently and crashed into the ravine, metal screeching against rock while wood splintered into 1,000 pieces. She had been thrown clear, tumbling down the embankment into a thicket of mesquite that tore her traveling dress but saved her life. And when she finally pulled herself upright on trembling legs, gasping for air that tasted of copper and fear, the dust was settling over the wreckage like a shroud, and she realized with a horror that hollowed out her chest that she was completely alone. The driver lay motionless 50 feet away, his neck bent at an unnatural angle, and the other passengers, a merchant and his wife from Santa Fe, were somewhere in that twisted heap of wood and iron, silent now after those terrible screams. Katherine stood there in the New Mexico wilderness, her hands shaking so badly she could barely brush the dirt from her face, and the September sun of 1877 beat down mercilessly as she tried to understand that everything had changed in a matter of seconds. The road to Placitas had seemed so simple that morning when she boarded the stage in Albuquerque, carrying nothing but a carpet bag and a letter from her aunt offering her a position as a schoolteacher in the small mining town. At 22 years old, Katherine had thought herself ready for adventure, ready to leave behind the confines of her parents' Boston home and make something of herself in the territories. Her father had forbidden it, of course, but her mother had secretly provided the train fare west, pressing coins into her hand with tears in her eyes and whispered encouragement. Now Katherine wished she had listened to her father's dire warnings about bandits and savages and the lawless nature of the frontier, because she was standing in the middle of nowhere with no water, no horse, and no idea which direction would lead to safety. She made herself walk back to the wreckage, forcing her legs to move even though every instinct screamed at her to run. The merchant and his wife were both dead, and Katherine said a prayer over them with tears streaming down her face, her voice breaking on the familiar words. She salvaged what she could from the debris. A canteen that was miraculously intact, some jerky from the driver's pack, and a blanket that smelled of horses but would keep her warm when the desert cold came with nightfall. Her own carpetbag had burst open, scattering her carefully packed belongings across the rocks, and she gathered what remained with numb fingers. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. Katherine's heart seized with terror, and she ducked behind a large boulder, clutching a rock in her hand as her only weapon. Bandits, she thought. They had caused the crash, shooting the horses to make the stage careen off the road, and now they were coming back to loot the wreckage and finish off any survivors. She pressed herself against the stone, hardly daring to breathe, as the rider came closer. "Anyone alive out here?" The voice was deep and carried a note of genuine concern rather than malice. "Saw the buzzards circling. If you can hear me, I mean no harm." Katherine peered around the boulder and saw a lone rider on a paint horse, a man with dark hair beneath a dusty hat, wearing worn leather chaps and a blue shirt faded from too many washings. He sat easy in the saddle, scanning the wreckage with sharp eyes, and there was something about the set of his shoulders that suggested capability rather than threat. Still, she hesitated, because trusting a stranger in this vast emptiness could mean death as easily as salvation. He dismounted and walked toward the overturned stagecoach, moving with the economical grace of someone who spent more time on horseback than on foot. She watched as he checked the bodies, removing his hat respectfully when he confirmed they were beyond help, and the gesture convinced her that he was not one of the men who had caused this tragedy. "I'm here," she called out, her voice hoarse from dust and shock. "I'm alive." He spun toward her, hand moving instinctively to the gun at his hip before he saw her and relaxed. Katherine stepped out from behind the boulder, acutely aware of how she must look with her dress torn and filthy, her dark hair escaping its pins in wild tangles, dirt streaking her face. She held herself as straight as she could manage, refusing to show the terror still coursing through her veins. "Madam." He approached slowly, both hands visible now, treating her like a spooked horse that might bolt. "Name's Jacob Jenkins. I've got a ranch about 10 miles north of here." "Are you hurt, Katherine Taylor?" She swallowed hard. "I don't think so. Bruised, but nothing broken. The others, they didn't make it. I can see that." His eyes were a startling blue-gray in his tanned face, and they held a steadiness that made something in her chest unclench slightly. "Where were you headed?" "Placida's. I have a teaching position waiting, or I did. I don't know now." The words came out in a rush, and she hated how young and frightened she sounded. "My aunt arranged it, but I was supposed to arrive today, and now I have no way to get there and no way to send word that I'm even alive." Jacob studied the wreckage again, his jaw tightening. This wasn't an accident. See those marks on the road? Someone strung a wire across it, meant to catch the horse's legs. Bandits have been working this stretch, hitting stages for the mining payrolls. He looked back at her, and something in his expression softened. "Placida's is about 15 miles southeast of here. I'll take you where you're going." Relief flooded through Katherine so powerfully that her knees nearly gave out. "Thank you. I can pay you not much, but I have a little money." "Don't want your money, Miss Taylor. Can't leave a lady stranded out here. Sun will be setting in a few hours, though, and it's rough country. We won't make it to Placida's before dark." He gestured to his horse. "My ranch is closer. You can stay there tonight, get cleaned up and rested, and I'll take you into town first thing tomorrow. My sister lives with me, so you don't need to worry about propriety." Katherine knew she had no real choice, but she appreciated that he offered it as one anyway. She nodded, gathering her scattered belongings and stuffing what she could back into the torn carpetbag. Jacob helped her, his movements efficient and courteous, and when everything salvageable was secured, he helped her mount his horse before swinging up behind her. The intimacy of it made her stiffen, awareness prickling across her skin as his arms came around her to hold the reins, but he kept a respectful distance as much as the saddle allowed. They rode in silence for a while, the horse picking its way through the scrub brush and rocky terrain with sure-footed confidence. Katherine tried to focus on the landscape rather than the warmth of Jacob's chest at her back, the strength in the arms bracketing her. The mountains rose purple and gold in the distance, beautiful and harsh in equal measure, and the air smelled of sage and dust. This was so far from the manicured gardens and cobblestone streets of Boston that it might as well have been another planet. "You came all the way from back east." Jacob's voice broke the silence, not intrusive but genuinely curious. "Boston. My parents thought I was mad to come out here, but I wanted something more than endless tea parties and making myself pleasant for suitable young men." She surprised herself with the honesty, but something about him invited it. "I wanted to do something that mattered. Teaching seems like it matters." "It does. Placida's has been needing a proper teacher for 2 years now. Most of the kids out here can barely read, and their parents are too busy working the mines or ranching to teach them properly." He shifted slightly in the saddle, adjusting their course around a stand of pinyon trees. "My sister will be glad to hear you made it. She's been corresponding with your aunt, I think. Julia gets involved in all the town business. You know my aunt. Everyone knows everyone in Placida's. It's not a big town, maybe 300 people counting the outlying ranches. Martha Thorne runs the boarding house and talks more than anyone I've ever met." "That your aunt?" Katherine laughed. the sound startling her because she had not thought herself capable of laughter after the horror of the day. "Yes, that sounds like Aunt Martha, my mother's older sister. She came west 20 years ago and never looked back. Sounds like stubbornness runs in your family." She heard the smile in his voice and felt an answering warmth in her chest. "I suppose it does." The ranch appeared as they crested a rise, a sprawling collection of buildings nestled in a valley with a creek running through it. The house was adobe, practical and weathered, with a covered porch and shutters that had once been painted green. Corrals held horses and cattle, and Katherine could see chickens scratching in a yard near a large barn. It was not grand, but it looked solid and real in a way that the elaborate mansions of Boston never had. A woman emerged from the house as they approached, shading her eyes against the lowering sun. She was perhaps a few years older than Jacob, with the same dark hair and strong features, wearing a simple dress and an apron dusted with flour. "Jacob, who's that with you?" "Julia, this is Miss Katherine Taylor, the new schoolteacher. Stage crashed about 10 miles south, bandits. She's the only survivor." He dismounted and reached up to help Katherine down, his hand steady at her waist. "Figured she could stay here tonight and I'll take her into town tomorrow." Julia's expression transformed from curiosity to concern, and she hurried forward to take Katherine's arm. "You poor thing. Come inside, you must be exhausted and terrified. Jacob, put some water on to heat. She needs a bath and food and probably a stiff drink." Katherine found herself swept into the house, into a world of whitewashed walls and simple furniture that somehow felt more welcoming than any of the ornate parlors she had known. Julia sat her down at a sturdy kitchen table and pressed a cup of water into her hands, talking the whole time about what had happened and how grateful they should all be that Katherine had survived. Jacob disappeared and returned with a large tin tub, which he began filling with heated water while Julia bustled around gathering soap and towels and a clean dress. "It will be too big for you, but it's better than that torn thing you're wearing," Julia said, pressing the garment into Katherine's hands. "I'll see what I can do about mending your dress tonight. Now, you take your time in that bath. We'll have supper ready when you're done." The bath was heaven, washing away the dust and blood and fear until Katherine felt almost human again. She soaked until the water cooled, letting the warmth seep into her bruised muscles, and when she finally emerged and dressed in Julia's borrowed clothes, she felt strong enough to face what came next. The dress was indeed too large, hanging loose on her frame, but it was clean and soft against her scrubbed skin. She found Julia and Jacob in the kitchen, working together to prepare supper with the easy coordination of people who had shared tasks for years. They had set the table with mismatched plates and cups, and the smell of frying meat and beans made Katherine's stomach clench with sudden hunger. She had not realized until that moment that she had not eaten since breakfast. "Sit, sit," Julia commanded, gesturing to a chair. "You need food." "Jacob, pour her some of that whiskey for the shock." Katherine wanted to protest that she was fine, but when Jacob set a small glass of amber liquid in front of her, she found herself drinking it. The whiskey burned going down and then spread warmth through her chest, taking the last of the ice-cold fear with it. She coughed and both siblings smiled, not mockingly but with understanding. They ate together as the last light faded outside the windows, and Katherine listened as Julia told her about Placida's and the people she would meet there. The town had grown up around silver mines in the Sandia Mountains, Julia explained, and while the mining was not as rich as some strikes further north, it provided enough work to keep families fed. There was a general store run by a German immigrant named Heinrich Müller, a saloon that got rowdy on Saturday nights, a small church where a circuit preacher came through once a month, and the boarding house where Aunt Martha held court. "Your aunt will be beside herself with worry when the stage doesn't arrive," Julia said, serving Katherine another helping of beans. "But Jacob can ride ahead tomorrow morning and let her know you're safe before bringing you in." "I can do that," Jacob agreed. He had been mostly quiet during the meal, but Katherine felt his eyes on her occasionally, assessing rather than intrusive. "Those bandits need to be reported to the sheriff too. Can't have them ambushing stages on that road. They killed 3 people today." Katherine set down her fork, appetite fading as the images came back. The driver, Mr. and Mrs. Harrison from Santa Fe, they were talking about their grandchildren just an hour before the crash. "I'm sorry you had to see that," Jacob said quietly. "This land can be hard, beautiful but hard." Katherine looked at him across the table, really looked at him for the first time since the shock of the accident had begun to fade. He was probably in his late 20s, with work-roughened hands and lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun. There was nothing soft about him, nothing polished or refined like the young men who had courted her in Boston, but there was a solidity to him that she found unexpectedly appealing. He met her gaze steadily, and something passed between them, a recognition that made her breath catch. Julia cleared her throat, breaking the moment. "Well, Katherine, you must be exhausted. I've made up the spare room for you. It's not fancy, but the bed is comfortable and you'll be safe here." Katherine helped clear the dishes despite Julia's protests, needing to do something useful with her hands. The spare room was indeed simple, with whitewashed walls and a narrow bed covered with a patchwork quilt. But after the day she had endured, it looked like paradise. She thanked them both and closed the door, then sat on the bed and finally let herself cry. The tears came silently, shaking her shoulders, mourning the people who had died and the innocence she had lost about what the West really meant. She had read dime novels about frontier adventure, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of death and danger. A soft knock on the door made her wipe her eyes quickly. "Yes, it's Jacob. I just wanted to make sure you had everything you need." She opened the door to find him standing there with a blanket draped over his arm and something that looked like concern in his eyes. "I'm fine, thank you. You and your sister have been incredibly kind. You're crying." It was a statement, not an accusation, and his voice was gentle. "I'm trying not to." She managed a weak smile. "Today was rather overwhelming. You're allowed to be overwhelmed. Most people would have fallen apart completely." He handed her the blanket. "Gets cold at night, and Katherine, you're safe here, I promise you that." The way he said her name, without the formal Miss Taylor, should have been presumptuous but instead felt like a gift. She took the blanket, their fingers brushing for a moment. "Thank you, Jacob, for everything. You saved my life today. Just happened to be in the right place." He shifted, looking almost uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be better." Katherine closed the door after he left and wrapped herself in the blanket he had brought, breathing in the smell of sage and leather that seemed to cling to everything in this house. She lay down on the bed, expecting to lie awake for hours, but exhaustion pulled her under almost immediately. She woke to sunlight streaming through the small window and the smell of coffee brewing. For a disoriented moment, she could not remember where she was, and then it all came rushing back. Katherine dressed quickly in the borrowed dress and braided her hair as neatly as she could without a mirror, then ventured out into the main room of the house. Julia was already up, cooking breakfast, and she greeted Katherine with a warm smile. "Good morning. I hope you slept well. Jacob left about an hour ago to ride into Placida's and let your aunt know you're alive. He should be back soon, and then he'll take you into town." "I did sleep, surprisingly well." Katherine accepted the cup of coffee Julia pressed into her hands. "Is there anything I can do to help?" "You're a guest, but if you insist, you can set the table." They worked together in companionable silence, and Katherine found herself wondering about Julia's life here on this isolated ranch. She wore no wedding ring, and there was no mention of a husband. "Have you lived here long?" Katherine asked. "All my life. Our parents homesteaded this land back in '58, right after the territory opened up. They died during a cholera outbreak 10 years ago, and Jacob and I have been running the ranch together ever since." Julia flipped bacon in the skillet, her movements practiced and sure. "It's a good life most of the time. Hard work, but honest. You never wanted to marry," Julia laughed, "but it held a bitter edge. I was engaged once to a man from Santa Fe. He came out for a visit and decided he couldn't stomach the isolation. Said I should sell the ranch and move to the city with him. I told him the ranch was my home and I wasn't leaving. He left instead. I'm sorry. Don't be. If he couldn't love me enough to stay, then he wasn't the right man." Julia served the bacon onto plates. "Jacob nearly got married a few years back too, to a girl from Albuquerque. She wanted him to give up ranching and work in her father's business. Seems like we Jenkins are too stubborn for our own good." Katherine heard hoofbeats outside and her heart jumped. Julia smiled knowingly. "That will be Jacob now. Eat quickly and then you can be on your way." Jacob came in looking windblown and slightly dusty, pulling off his hat as he entered. His eyes found Katherine immediately, and something in his expression eased when he saw her. "Morning. Your aunt is relieved and wants to see you as soon as possible. Half the town knows about the crash already, and everyone's talking about it." "How did they find out so quickly?" Katherine asked. "Mueller's boy was out hunting early and saw the wreckage. He rode back and told everyone. The sheriff is organizing a posse to go after the bandits." Jacob sat down at the table, accepting the plate Julia handed him. "We should head out as soon as we finish eating. It's about an hour's ride to town." The hour passed too quickly. Katherine found herself reluctant to leave the sanctuary of the ranch, this brief respite from the world that had turned so dangerous. But duty called, and her aunt was waiting, and her new life as a schoolteacher was delayed but not destroyed. Julia pressed a bundle into her hands as she was leaving, Katherine's dress mended as neatly as if the tears had never happened, along with some biscuits wrapped in cloth. "Come visit us," Julia said, embracing Katherine warmly. "I don't have many female friends out here, and I like you." "I will, I promise." This time when Jacob helped Katherine onto his horse, the contact did not startle her. She settled against him as if they had been riding together for years, and when his arms came around her to take the reins, she felt protected rather than uncomfortable. They set off toward Placida's at an easy pace, the morning sun warm on their faces and the air carrying the promise of autumn. "Your aunt is quite a character," Jacob said after a while. "She practically interrogated me about my intentions when I told her you were at the ranch." Katherine felt her cheeks heat. She did not. She did. Wanted to know if I had behaved as a gentleman, if Julia was really there as a chaperone, and whether I was planning to take advantage of an innocent girl from the East. He sounded amused rather than offended. "I assured her that your virtue was completely intact. I'm mortified." "Don't be. She's protective of you, that's all, and she has a right to be given what happened." His voice turned serious. "Katherine, if you need anything while you're getting settled in Placida's, you let me know. Julia and I are only about 10 miles away, and I come into town for supplies every week." "Why are you being so kind to me?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "You don't know me. Maybe I want to know you." The words were quiet, almost lost in the sound of the horse's hooves, but they sent warmth spreading through Katherine's chest. "You're brave. Anyone else would have been completely hysterical after what you went through, but you kept your head, and you have kind eyes. That matters more than you might think out here." Katherine did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, just leaned back slightly until she could feel the solid warmth of him behind her. They rode on in silence, and the landscape began to change as they approached Placida's. The scattered ranches gave way to more frequent buildings, and then they were riding down what passed for a main street, a dusty thoroughfare lined with wooden structures that had the raw, unfinished look of a town still being built. People stopped what they were doing to stare as they passed, and Katherine heard the whispers starting. "The schoolteacher who survived. The stage crash. Is that Jacob Jenkins with her?" She held her head high, refusing to show the flutter of nervousness in her stomach. And then they were pulling up in front of a 2-story building with a sign that read Martha Thorne's boarding house. The door flew open before Jacob could even help Katherine dismount, and a woman who could only be Aunt Martha rushed out. She was tall and broad-shouldered, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that were sharp but warm. "Katherine, oh, thank the Lord you're alive. When I heard about the crash, I thought the worst." Katherine found herself enveloped in a crushing embrace that smelled of lavender and baking bread. "I'm fine, Aunt Martha, bruised and shaken but alive." Martha held her at arm's length, examining her critically. "You look half-starved. And is that Julia Jenkins' dress? Jacob, bring her inside this instant. And you come in too, I want to hear exactly what happened." The boarding house was as warm and cluttered as Martha herself, full of mismatched furniture and lace doilies and the smell of something delicious cooking. Martha installed Katherine in a comfortable chair in the parlor and brought tea and cake, then sat down with the expectant air of someone waiting for a story. Jacob stood near the door, hat in hand, looking like he wanted to escape but was too polite to do so. Katherine told the story of the crash, leaving out the worst details of the bodies and her own terror. Martha listened with a hand pressed to her bosom, making distressed noises at appropriate intervals. When Katherine finished, Martha turned her penetrating gaze on Jacob. "And you just happened to come across her in all that wilderness?" "I was checking my fence lines and saw buzzards circling, went to investigate and found the wreckage." Jacob met Martha's eyes steadily. "Miss Taylor was the only survivor. I couldn't leave her there." "Of course not. You're a good man, Jacob Jenkins, just like your father was." Martha softened slightly. "Your sister is well, I hope." "She is, thank you. She sends her regards. You tell her to come visit me soon. I miss our chats." Martha turned back to Katherine, dismissing Jacob with the air of a general dismissing a subordinate. "Now, dear, you'll be staying here with me until we can get you settled in the teacher's cottage. The school board has been fixing it up, but it won't be ready for another week. You'll have your own room here, 3 meals a day, and I'll introduce you to everyone in town." Jacob cleared his throat. "I should be going. Miss Taylor, I'm glad you made it safely. Mrs. Thorne, a pleasure as always." Katherine stood quickly, not ready for him to leave even though she knew he had to. "Wait, Jacob, I never properly thanked you. You saved my life and I don't know how to repay that." "You don't need to repay anything." He smiled at her, and it transformed his serious face into something almost handsome. "But if you want to thank me, you could save me a dance at the Harvest Social next month. Julia says I need to be more sociable. I would like that very much." She walked him to the door, aware of Martha watching them with interest. Jacob paused on the threshold, looking down at her with those steady blue-gray eyes. "You're going to do well here, Katherine, I can tell. This town needs someone like you. Someone stubborn and reckless. Someone brave and determined." He put his hat on, tipping it to her. "I'll see you soon." Katherine watched him ride away, and something in her chest ached with unexpected longing. She barely knew him, had spent less than a day in his company, but he had been solid and dependable when her world had shattered. That meant something, even if she could not yet define what. "Well," Martha said from behind her, making Katherine jump, "that young man is quite taken with you." "Aunt Martha, I've only just met him." "I've lived in the West for 20 years, girl. I know attraction when I see it, and Jacob Jenkins was looking at you like you were water in the desert." Martha steered Katherine back inside, her expression knowing. "He's a good man, owns his land free and clear, respected in the community. You could do far worse. I came here to teach, not to find a husband. Why not do both? You're young and pretty, and there are 3 men for every woman out here. You'll have your pick of suitors before the month is out." Katherine did not want to think about suitors. She wanted to focus on the teaching position, on making a life for herself independent of any man. But she found her thoughts drifting back to Jacob as Martha showed her to her room, a cozy space with a window overlooking the street. She unpacked the few belongings that had survived the crash, hanging her mended dress in the wardrobe and arranging her books on a small shelf. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Martha took Katherine around town, introducing her to seemingly every person in Placitas. She met Heinrich Mueller at the general store, a kindly man with a thick accent who insisted on giving her credit for any supplies she needed. She met Reverend Thomas, who came through town and expressed his delight at having an educated woman to help with the Sunday school. She met the members of the school board, a collection of miners and ranchers who were thrilled to finally have a proper teacher. The school itself was a small building on the edge of town, one room with rows of benches and a desk at the front. It had been recently whitewashed and smelled of fresh wood and chalk. Katherine stood in the empty room and felt a thrill of excitement mixed with terror. She would be responsible for educating the children of this community, shaping their minds and their futures. It was exactly what she had wanted, exactly why she had come west. The teacher's cottage next to the school was small but charming, with 2 rooms and a little porch. The school board had furnished it with the basics: a bed, a table and chairs, a stove for cooking and heating. Martha helped Katherine sew curtains for the windows and brought spare dishes and pots from the boarding house. By the end of the week, the cottage felt like home. Katherine's first day of teaching arrived with a September morning that was crisp and clear. She wore her mended traveling dress and pinned her hair up carefully, wanting to look professional and capable. The children began arriving around 8 o'clock, escorted by parents who looked at Katherine with a mixture of hope and skepticism. She had 14 students ranging in age from 6 to 15, a mix of miners' children and ranch kids who would have to ride for miles each day to attend. She began by introducing herself and asking each child to do the same. They were shy at first, mumbling their names and ages, but gradually they warmed to her enthusiasm. She assessed their reading and arithmetic skills and found them rudimentary but not hopeless. These were children who spent more time working than studying, whose parents valued practical skills over book learning, but they were eager to learn once they realized she would not be boring or cruel. The first week of teaching was exhausting but rewarding. Katherine developed a routine, starting each day with reading practice and moving through arithmetic, geography, and history. She told stories to illustrate her lessons, making the children laugh with her dramatic readings. She was patient with the slower learners and challenged the quicker ones. By Friday, she felt like she was actually making a difference. She did not see Jacob during that week, though she thought about him more often than she cared to admit. Julia came into town on Wednesday to shop at Mueller's store, and she stopped by the school to visit Katherine during lunch. "You're a natural teacher," Julia said, watching Katherine interact with the children in the schoolyard. "They adore you already, I can tell. They're good children, a little wild but good." Katherine smiled as two boys chased each other past, whooping like Indians. "How is Jacob?" "Working himself half to death as usual. We have a buyer coming next week to look at some horses, and Jacob wants everything perfect." Julia gave Katherine a sly look. "He asks about you every night at supper. Wants to know if I've seen you, how the teaching is going, whether you're settling in well." Katherine felt her cheeks warm. "Does he? He's taken with you, Katherine. I've never seen my brother so interested in a woman, not even with his former fiancée." Julia squeezed Katherine's hand. "And I think you might feel the same way about him. I barely know him. Then get to know him better. He'll be at the harvest social, and half the unmarried women in town will be throwing themselves at him. You should stake your claim before someone else does." Katherine laughed at Julia's bluntness, but the idea planted itself in her mind. She found herself thinking about the dance Jacob had asked for, wondering what it would be like to be held in his arms, to look up into those steady eyes and see something more than kindness there. The harvest social was held on a Saturday evening in late September, when the heat of summer had finally broken, and the air carried the promise of autumn. The entire town turned out, gathering at the community hall that also served as the church on Sundays. Tables had been set up outside covered with food that the women had been preparing for days. Roasted meats and potato salads, corn bread and apple pies, jugs of cider and lemonade. Lanterns hung from the trees, casting golden light as the sun set behind the mountains. Katherine wore her best dress, a blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes, and let Martha help her style her hair into something more elaborate than her usual braid. She felt nervous as they walked to the social, smoothing her skirts repeatedly and worrying that she would not know how to behave. Boston society parties had been formal and choreographed, but this was something entirely different. The moment they arrived, Katherine was swept up in the energy of the gathering. People called out greetings, children ran wild in games of tag, and musicians were setting up their instruments in one corner of the hall. Martha introduced her to people she had not yet met, and Katherine found herself laughing and talking more freely than she had in weeks. She was in the middle of a conversation with Mrs. Mueller about the school curriculum when she felt eyes on her. She turned and saw Jacob standing near the food tables with a group of other ranchers, but he was not paying attention to their conversation. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Their eyes met across the crowd, and he smiled slowly, tipping his hat to her. Katherine excused herself and made her way through the crowd toward him, her heart beating faster with each step. He moved to meet her halfway, and suddenly they were standing face to face with people swirling around them. "You look beautiful," Jacob said, and the simple sincerity in his voice was more affecting than any flowery compliment she had received in Boston. "Thank you. You clean up well yourself." It was true. He wore a white shirt and a black vest, his hair still damp from washing, and he looked almost civilized except for the way he moved, that easy confidence that came from a life spent outdoors. "I was hoping you would be here. You asked me for a dance, remember? I couldn't very well miss it." The music started, a lively fiddle tune that had people pairing off for a reel. Jacob held out his hand. "May I?" Katherine placed her hand in his and let him lead her into the dance. She knew the basic steps from dancing lessons in Boston. But this was faster and less formal, with couples spinning and laughing and sometimes crashing into each other. Jacob was a surprisingly good dancer, guiding her through the movements with sure hands, and Katherine found herself grinning as they whirled around the floor when the reel ended. A slower waltz began. Jacob pulled her close, one hand at her waist and the other holding hers, and they swayed together in time with the music. Katherine could feel the heat of his body through her dress, could smell the soap he had used and the underlying scent that was just him. She looked up and found him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "I've been thinking about you," he said quietly, the words just for her. "Every day since I found you by that stagecoach, I can't seem to stop. I've been thinking about you too." The admission felt dangerous and thrilling at once. "You've been very kind to me, Jacob. I don't want to be kind." His hand tightened at her waist, drawing her slightly closer. "I want to court you properly, Katherine. Take you to dinners and dances, come visit you at the school, let everyone in town know that you're spoken for. If you'll let me." Katherine's pulse raced. She had known him for less than 2 weeks, but in that time he had become something essential to her sense of safety and belonging in this strange new place. "Yes," she whispered, "I would like that very much." Jacob's smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face. "Then I'm the luckiest man in New Mexico." They danced 2 more songs, lost in each other, before Martha came to find Katherine and remind her that people were watching and she should probably circulate. Katherine reluctantly left Jacob's arms and spent the rest of the evening being sociable, but her awareness never left him. She felt his eyes on her throughout the night, and whenever she looked his way, he was watching her with that same intense focus. The courtship that followed was both swift and thorough. Jacob came to town twice a week, bringing Katherine wildflowers from the ranch and staying for supper at Martha's boarding house. They took long walks through the dusty streets of Placitas, talking about everything and nothing. Katherine told him about growing up in Boston, about her strict father and loving mother, about her dreams of making a difference in the world. Jacob told her about working the ranch, about the satisfaction of raising horses and cattle, about the loneliness of his life before she arrived. He came to the school sometimes and sat in the back, watching Katherine teach with an expression of wonder. The children quickly adopted him as a sort of unofficial uncle, pestering him with questions about ranching and horses during recess. Jacob was patient with them, answering their questions seriously and even bringing his gentlest horse one day to let them take turns riding. Martha approved of the courtship, though she worried about the speed of it. "You've only known him a month," she said one evening as they sat in the parlor mending clothes. "Are you sure this is what you want?" "I've never been more sure of anything," Katherine replied, and she meant it. Jacob had become as necessary to her as breathing, and she could not imagine her life without him in it. Julia visited often, becoming the close friend Katherine had always wanted. The 3 of them, Katherine, Julia, and Martha, formed an unlikely trio that met for tea and gossip and laughter. Julia confided that she had never seen her brother so happy, that he smiled now where before he had been serious and withdrawn. By the time October arrived, painting the cottonwoods along the creek gold and crimson, Katherine knew she was deeply in love with Jacob Jenkins. The realization came one evening when he was walking her home from the boarding house to her cottage. The moon was full and bright, turning the desert silver, and Jacob had been telling her about a foal born that morning. He stopped talking mid-sentence and turned to her, his expression suddenly serious. "Katherine, I need to tell you something," her heart stuttered. "What is it?" "I love you." The words came out rough and honest. "I know it's too soon. I know you might not feel the same way, but I can't keep it inside anymore. I love you and I want to marry you. I want to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life. I want to build a life with you, have children with you, grow old with you." Katherine felt tears prick her eyes. "It's not too soon. I love you too, Jacob. I think I've loved you since that first day when you found me and promised to take me where I was going." He kissed her then, his first real kiss, and it was everything she had dreamed it would be. His lips were warm and sure against hers, his hands gentle as they cupped her face. Katherine melted into him, wrapping her arms around his neck, and the kiss deepened until they were both breathing hard and trembling. "Marry me," Jacob said against her mouth. "Please, Katherine, be my wife." "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married in November, just 2 months after the stagecoach crash that had brought them together. Reverend Thomas performed the ceremony in the small church, with half the town crowded inside and the other half standing outside in the crisp autumn air. Katherine wore a dress that Martha and Julia had helped her make, simple white cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. Jacob wore his best suit and looked nervous and proud in equal measure. Martha cried throughout the ceremony, and even Julia wiped away tears. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them man and wife, and Jacob kissed Katherine in front of everyone, cheers erupted. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with dancing and food and toasts to the happy couple. Jacob and Katherine spent their wedding night at the ranch, in the room that would now be theirs together. Jacob was gentle and patient, making their first time together something beautiful rather than frightening. Katherine fell asleep in his arms, feeling safer and more content than she had ever been in her life. The adjustment to married life was easier than Katherine had expected. She continued teaching, riding out to the ranch each Friday afternoon and staying through Sunday before returning to her cottage near the school. Jacob wanted her to give up teaching and live at the ranch full-time, but he understood when she explained how important her work was to her. "The children need me," she said, "and I need them. Teaching makes me feel like I'm making a real difference." "Then you keep teaching as long as you want," Jacob replied. "I fell in love with your strength and independence. I'm not going to try to change that now." The pattern of their lives settled into a comfortable rhythm. Katherine taught during the week, throwing herself into her work with passion. Her students flourished under her attention, and even the school board commented on how much progress they had made. On weekends, Katherine helped Julia with the housework and learned the skills of frontier life: how to bake bread in the temperamental adobe oven, how to preserve vegetables for the winter, how to mend clothes and make soap. Jacob worked from dawn to dusk, managing the ranch with the same steady competence he brought to everything. Katherine loved watching him with the horses, the gentleness in his rough hands as he worked with a skittish colt or doctored a sick mare. He was building something lasting, something that would endure, and she was proud to be part of it. Their first Christmas together was simple but perfect. Julia and Katherine decorated the ranch house with pine boughs and candles, and they invited Martha out for Christmas dinner. Jacob gave Katherine a beautiful leather-bound journal for recording her thoughts, and she gave him a new saddle blanket she had woven herself with Julia's patient instruction. They sat by the fire that night, the 4 of them, and sang carols while the wind howled outside. In January, Katherine realized she was pregnant. The signs were unmistakable: the morning nausea, the exhaustion that hit her in waves, the tenderness in her breasts. She waited until she was certain before telling Jacob, wanting to be sure. When she finally spoke the words one evening as they lay in bed, Jacob's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He whooped with joy and lifted her off her feet, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. "We're having a baby," he kept saying, as if he could not quite believe it. "Katherine, we're going to be parents." "I hope you're ready," she teased, "because this child is going to have your stubbornness and my determination. Heaven help us all." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the cold months of winter and into the warmth of spring. Katherine continued teaching until May, when her growing belly made it difficult to stand for long periods. The school board reluctantly agreed to find a substitute teacher for the last month of the school year, and Katherine moved to the ranch full-time to prepare for the baby's arrival. Julia was ecstatic about becoming an aunt and threw herself into preparing the nursery. She and Katherine sewed tiny clothes and blankets, washed and folded diapers, and made sure everything was ready for the new arrival. Jacob built a beautiful cradle from cottonwood, sanding it until it was smooth as silk and carving their initials into the headboard. The baby came on a warm June evening in 1878, after a labor that lasted 12 hours and left Katherine exhausted but triumphant. Dr. Morrison, who had ridden out from Placida's when her pain started, placed the squalling infant in her arms and announced, "You have a son, Mrs. Jenkins." A healthy boy. Katherine looked down at the red-faced, wrinkled little creature she had created and felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it was almost painful. Jacob, who had been pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door, came in and stared at his son with wonder written across his face. "He's perfect," Jacob whispered, reaching out a tentative finger to touch the baby's tiny hand. "Katherine, he's absolutely perfect." They named him James after Jacob's father, and from the moment he entered the world, he ruled the household with his needs and demands. Katherine had never been so tired or so happy in her life. The long nights of feeding and changing and soothing were exhausting, but every smile, every coo, every small milestone made it worthwhile. Jacob was a devoted father, taking James out to the barn to see the horses as soon as he could hold his head up, talking to him constantly in that low, soothing voice. Katherine would watch them together and feel overwhelmed with gratitude for the life she had built here in this harsh, beautiful land. The years that followed were full and rich. Katherine returned to teaching when James was a year old, bringing him to school with her until he was old enough to stay at the ranch with Julia during the day. She loved her work and her students loved her, but she also loved coming home to Jacob and James, to the ranch that had become her sanctuary. They had 2 more children in the years that followed. A daughter named Sarah, born in 1880, with Katherine's dark hair and Jacob's steady eyes, and another son, Matthew, born in 1882. The ranch house rang with children's laughter and the chaos of family life. Julia continued to live with them, helping with the children and the household, and she seemed content with her role as beloved aunt. Martha remained a constant presence in their lives, visiting often and spoiling her great nieces and nephews shamelessly. She continued running the boarding house in Placida's until she was well into her 70s, a fixture of the community who knew everyone's business and was not shy about sharing her opinions. The town of Placida's grew and changed over the years. The mines played out eventually, but the town survived by diversifying into ranching and farming. New families arrived, the school expanded to 2 rooms and then 3, and Katherine trained young women to help her teach the growing number of students. She became known throughout the territory as an excellent educator, and she took pride in watching her former students grow up to become productive members of the community. Jacob's ranch prospered too. He became known for raising quality horses, and buyers came from as far as Texas to purchase his stock. The work was hard, made harder by droughts and harsh winters and the unpredictable nature of frontier life. But Jacob faced every challenge with the same steady determination that had first attracted Katherine to him. Their marriage deepened with the years, growing from passionate love into something richer and more complex. They knew each other's rhythms and moods, could communicate with a look across a crowded room, supported each other through joys and sorrows. When Katherine's mother died back in Boston, Jacob held her while she cried and never told her to be strong. When Jacob lost a promising colt to a rattlesnake bite, Katherine sat with him in the barn and let him grieve. They celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary in 1887 with a party that brought together all of Placida's. Katherine looked around at the gathered friends and family, at Jacob laughing with the other ranchers, at their 3 children playing with the others, at Julia and Martha chatting together like sisters, and felt a profound sense of contentment. This was not the life she had imagined when she boarded that stagecoach in Albuquerque all those years ago, but it was infinitely better. As the sun set that evening, painting the New Mexico sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jacob pulled Katherine away from the crowd and led her to the porch where they had first kissed. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Staying here instead of going back east, teaching instead of having a more genteel life?" Katherine leaned back against him, feeling the solid strength of his body supporting hers. "Not for a single moment. That stagecoach crash brought me to you, Jacob. It brought me home. I still can't believe you said yes when I asked to take you where you were going," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "I took one look at you standing there in the desert, so brave and strong, and I knew my life was about to change forever. And did it? Change, I mean. In every possible way. You gave me a family, Katherine. You gave me love and purpose and a reason to work harder and be better. You gave me everything." Katherine turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to cup his weathered face in her hands. The years had added lines around his eyes and threads of silver in his dark hair, but he was still the man who had rescued her that day, still the steady presence that made her feel safe and cherished. "You gave me everything too. A home, a family, a life that matters. I love you, Jacob Jenkins." "I love you too." He kissed her softly, a promise and a benediction. "Always." They stood there together as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared, and Katherine thought about the strange and wonderful path that had led her to this moment. She had come west seeking adventure and independence, armed with nothing but determination and a carpetbag. She had survived a stagecoach crash that killed everyone else, had been rescued by a cowboy who became her husband, and had built a life richer than any she could have imagined. Their children grew up strong and capable, products of the frontier that shaped them. James took over the ranch when Jacob grew older, managing it with the same steady competence his father had shown. Sarah became a teacher like her mother, opening a school in a neighboring town. Matthew, the youngest, became a veterinarian, using his natural affinity for animals to help ranchers throughout the territory. Julia never married, but she lived a full and happy life surrounded by nieces and nephews who adored her. She helped raise Jacob and Katherine's children, and later their grandchildren, and was considered the heart of the family by everyone who knew her. When she finally passed away in her sleep at the age of 75, the entire town of Placida's mourned. Martha lived to see New Mexico become a state in 1912, declaring it the proudest day of her life. She finally sold the boarding house at the age of 80 and moved to the ranch to spend her final years with Katherine and Jacob. She died peacefully in the spring of 1915, surrounded by the family she had helped create, and her funeral was the largest Placida's had ever seen. Jacob and Katherine grew old together at the ranch, watching the world change around them while their love remained constant. The wild frontier of their youth gave way to statehood and progress, with automobiles replacing horses and electricity coming to even the most remote areas. But the land itself remained timeless, the mountains still rising purple against the horizon, the sky still vast and endless. On a warm September evening in 1927, exactly 50 years after the stagecoach crash that had brought them together. Katherine and Jacob sat on the porch of the ranch house watching the sunset. They were both in their 70s now, their bodies bent with age and hard work, but they still held hands like newlyweds. 50 years, Katherine mused, squeezing Jacob's calloused hand. Can you believe it? Best 50 years of my life, Jacob replied. I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. Even the parts where I was stubborn and difficult, especially those parts. You wouldn't be you without that stubbornness. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. Do you remember what I said to you that day, when I found you by the stagecoach? Katherine smiled, the memory as clear as if it had happened yesterday. You said you would take me where I was going. And did I take you where you were going? You did more than that. You took me home, Jacob. You gave me a home I never knew I was looking for, and I've been grateful for it every single day since. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. Inside the house, they could hear the sounds of their family. James and his wife preparing supper, grandchildren playing and laughing, the normal chaos of a household full of love. This was their legacy, Katherine thought. Not just the land or the ranch or even their children, but the love they had built together from that chance meeting in the desert. Jacob had taken her where she was going all those years ago, but the destination had been so much better than anything she could have imagined. It had been love and family and home and belonging. It had been a life well lived, full of hard work and joy and sorrows and triumphs. It had been everything. As the last light faded from the sky and the desert night closed in around them, Katherine leaned her head on Jacob's shoulder and closed her eyes, feeling his heartbeat steady and sure beneath her cheek. They had built something beautiful together, something that would endure long after they were gone. Their children would tell their grandchildren about the stagecoach crash and the cowboy and the teacher who fell in love. And the story would become part of the family mythology, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best things. The Wild West had been harsh and dangerous and unforgiving, but it had also been full of possibility for those brave enough to seize it. Katherine had seized her chance that day when she accepted Jacob's offer, and it had made all the difference. She had found her place in the world, and more importantly, she had found her person, the one who made everything else make sense. As she drifted off to sleep there on the porch with Jacob's arms around her, Katherine smiled, content in the knowledge that their story had reached its perfect ending. The dust had settled that day 50 years ago, and from the settling had come a love story that would endure forever, a testament to the power of courage and kindness, and choosing to trust a stranger who promised to take you where you were going. And where they had gone together was somewhere more wonderful than either of them could have dreamed.